Okay, so FBI Director Kash Patel is in absolute full panic mode right now. And I mean, this is not just some typical Washington drama or another news cycle story that's going to fade in a week. This is massive. This is the kind of moment that fundamentally redefines the presidency, reshapes the balance of power between institutions, and honestly determines whether we still have any meaningful checks on executive authority in this country. What we're witnessing right now is a crisis that has implications far beyond the immediate parties involved. We're talking about something that affects the 2026 midterms, Trump's ability to govern for the rest of his term, America's credibility with international allies, judicial independence, the rule of law itself, and the basic question of whether our institutions can still push back when a president clearly oversteps his constitutional authority. This isn't going away. This isn't something that gets resolved with one court hearing or one news conference. This is the beginning of a legal and political battle that's going to play out over months, maybe years, and the outcome is going to shape American government for decades to come. This is the kind of story that historians will point to when they write about how American democracy either survived the Trump era or collapsed under the weight of authoritarian ambitions. But before we dive deep into exactly what happened, why it matters so much, and what comes next, I need to be completely honest with you about something. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. You just can't. They're either too partisan to give you the straight story, too beholden to corporate advertisers to ask tough questions, or too worried about maintaining access to powerful people to actually hold them accountable. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, real analysis, and absolutely no corporate spin. We're not afraid to call out corruption when we see it. We're not afraid to challenge power. We're not afraid to tell you what's really happening behind the carefully crafted press releases and sanitized news coverage. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, if you want to understand what's really happening in American politics instead of just consuming whatever narrative the mainstream media wants you to believe, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring the news straight to you every single day. Real journalism, real analysis, real accountability. Just hit the subscribe button below to join us. And if you want to support this work and be part of a community that truly cares about the truth, about democracy, about holding powerful people accountable, this is your moment. Subscribe. Join us. Be part of something that actually matters. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. Kash Patel in the CROSSHAIRS. Heavy lawsuit from former FBI agent. And when you actually dig into the details of this story, when you go beyond the surface level headlines and really examine what's going on, it's even more disturbing, even more consequential, even more dangerous than you might initially think. Because what we're seeing here is not an isolated incident. This is part of a systematic pattern of behavior that reveals something deeply troubling about Trump's approach to power and his willingness to demolish long-standing norms and legal protections to get what he wants. Let me walk you through the timeline step by step, because context is absolutely everything here. You need to understand how we got to this point, what the key decisions were, who the major players are, and why each detail matters for the bigger picture of what's happening to American government right now. The story actually starts years ago, but it's coming to a head right now in a way that could not be more consequential. The immediate trigger was recent, but The roots of this crisis go back through Trump's first term, through the investigations he faced, through the institutional pushback he encountered, and through the revenge fantasies he's been nurturing ever since. Because here's what you need to understand about Trump. He does not forget. He does not forgive. He does not let go of perceived slights or challenges to his authority. When someone investigates him, when someone rules against him, when someone enforces laws he doesn't like, when someone stands up and says, "No, Mr. President, you can't do that," Trump files that information away. And when he gets the power to strike back, he uses it without hesitation and without mercy. So, what we're seeing now is the execution of a revenge campaign that Trump has been planning for years. It's methodical, it's systematic, it's ruthless, and it's absolutely terrifying if you care about democracy and the rule of law. The specific facts of this case are important because they illustrate the broader pattern. We're talking about people who are doing their jobs, following the law, exercising their professional judgment, and now they're being targeted for political retaliation. We're talking about experienced professionals with decades of service being thrown out like garbage because they're not sufficiently loyal to Trump. We're talking about critical national security functions being compromised because expertise and competence matter less than political allegiance. And here's what makes this moment so significant. It's not just about the people directly involved, as important as their stories are. It's about the precedent being established. It's about the message being sent to everyone else in government. The message is crystal clear. If you cross Trump, if you investigate him, if you enforce laws he doesn't like, if you make decisions that conflict with his political interests, then you will be targeted. Your career will be destroyed. You might face legal jeopardy yourself. There is no safe harbor. There is no protection. There is no independence that can shield you from retaliation. Think about what that means for the future of American government. Think about the chilling effect that has on anyone who might be in a position to hold the president accountable. If you're a federal prosecutor and you see what's happening to people who investigated Trump, are you going to be eager to investigate the next president who breaks the law? If you're a career official at an independent agency and you see people being fired for enforcing regulations Trump doesn't like, are you going to stand up for the rule of law, or are you going to keep your head down and hope you don't become the next target? That's how authoritarian systems work. You don't need to explicitly threaten everyone. You just need to make a few high-profile examples, destroy a few people's lives in very public ways, and everyone else gets the message. Everyone else learns to keep quiet, to go along, to prioritize their own survival over their professional obligations or their constitutional duties. And that's exactly what Trump is doing right now. He's creating a climate of fear throughout the federal government. He's showing everyone what happens to people who don't demonstrate sufficient loyalty. He's dismantling the protections that allow government officials to do their jobs without fear of political retaliation. The details of how this is playing out are important because they reveal the machinery of Trump's authoritarian project. We're not just talking about informal pressure or nasty tweets anymore. We're talking about formal government proceedings being weaponized. We're talking about congressional subpoenas being used as tools of intimidation. We're talking about the Justice Department potentially being turned into an instrument of political revenge. We're talking about systematic purges of career officials across multiple agencies. And all of this is happening right now, in real time, while most Americans are focused on their daily lives and not fully grasping the magnitude of what's being dismantled. The mainstream media reports on individual incidents, but often fails to connect the dots or convey the urgency of the moment. They treat each story as a discrete event rather than as part of a coherent strategy to fundamentally transform American government. But when you step back and look at the full picture, when you see all the pieces moving at once, when you understand the legal theories being advanced and the precedents being challenged and the institutions being attacked, it becomes absolutely clear what's happening. This is a coup in slow motion. This is the systematic destruction of the checks and balances that have protected American democracy for more than 2 centuries. This is authoritarianism taking root in America, and it's being done through legal processes and bureaucratic procedures and court filings, which somehow makes it seem less urgent to people who aren't paying close attention. But make no mistake, this is an emergency. This is a crisis. This is a turning point, and how we respond to it, how our institutions respond to it, how voters respond to it in the 2026 midterms will determine what kind of country we leave to the next generation. Now, let's talk about the legal and institutional context here, because there are mechanisms and doctrines and precedents at play that most people don't fully understand, but which are absolutely critical to grasping why this situation is so dangerous and why the stakes are so extraordinarily high. The fundamental architecture of American government is based on something called separation of powers. The founders, fresh from their experience with British monarchy, were absolutely obsessed with preventing the concentration of too much authority in any single person or institution. So, they created a system where power is divided among three co-equal branches. Congress makes the laws, the president executes them, and courts interpret them. Each branch is supposed to check and balance the others. This wasn't just some theoretical exercise in political philosophy. The founders had seen firsthand what happens when one person wields unchecked power. They understood that even well-intentioned leaders can become tyrannical if there are no constraints on their authority. So, they built a system designed to prevent any American president from becoming a king. Within that framework, over the decades and centuries that followed, we developed additional institutional protections, civil service laws that prevent presidents from firing federal employees for political reasons, independent agencies that can operate with some degree of autonomy from direct presidential control, inspectors general who can investigate corruption and abuse without fear of retaliation, ethics rules, and conflict of interest regulations. All of these protections emerged from hard experience, from learning what can go wrong when power is exercised without adequate oversight. The specific legal protections for federal employees are particularly important to understand. For most of the 19th century, federal jobs were awarded through the spoil system. When a new president came into office, he would fire everyone from the previous administration and install his own people. This led to massive corruption, incompetence, and instability in government. So, Congress passed the Pendleton Act in 1883, creating a merit-based civil service system with protections against arbitrary termination. The principle was simple. Federal employees should be hired and fired based on their qualifications and job performance, not based on their political loyalty or personal relationship with the president. This wasn't about making government inflexible or preventing accountability. It was about creating a professional, competent, stable civil service that could serve the public interest regardless of which party controlled the White House. Similarly, the concept of independent agencies developed because Congress recognized that certain functions need to be insulated from direct political control. Financial regulation, for example. You don't want the president to be able to fire the chair of the Federal Reserve whenever the Fed makes a monetary policy decision that's economically sound, but politically inconvenient. You don't want the president to be able to fire the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission because Wall Street cronies are complaining about enforcement actions. You don't want environmental regulations to flip back and forth wildly every time a new president takes office. So Congress created independent agencies with structural protections. Agency heads serve fixed terms. They can only be removed for cause, not just because the president disagrees with their decisions. They're supposed to be able to exercise their professional judgment based on law and evidence, not based on political pressure from the White House. The Supreme Court upheld these protections in cases like Humphrey's Executor for United States in 1935, which established that Congress has the power to create independent agencies and limit the president's ability to fire their leaders. This has been settled law for 90 years. It's been the foundation of how independent agencies operate throughout that entire period. But Trump is challenging all of this. Trump and his legal team are arguing for a radical expansion of presidential power. They're saying the president should be able to fire anyone in the executive branch, including independent agency heads, for any reason or no reason at all. They're saying that limits on presidential removal power are unconstitutional. They're asking the Supreme Court to overturn decades of precedent and dramatically reshape the structure of American government. And here's what's truly alarming. They might win. The current Supreme Court has shown a willingness to overturn long-standing precedents when conservative justices believe those precedents were wrongly decided. The court has already issued rulings that expand presidential immunity and limit congressional oversight. The court has shown itself to be sympathetic to arguments about executive power and skeptical of constraints on presidential authority. If Trump wins these cases, if the court rules that he can fire independent agency heads at will, the implications are staggering. It means the president would have essentially unlimited control over financial regulation, environmental enforcement, consumer protection, workplace safety, food and drug safety, telecommunications policy, and countless other areas that affect every American's daily life. It means all of those policies would become directly subordinated to the president's political agenda and personal interests. It means there would be no independent check on presidential power in vast swaths of government activity. And it's not just about independent agencies. The same logic applies to career civil servants throughout the executive branch. If the president can fire anyone for political reasons, then everyone becomes political. Everyone knows their job depends on demonstrating loyalty to the president. Everyone knows that exercising independent judgment, following inconvenient laws, or speaking uncomfortable truths could get them terminated. That's not how democracies work. That's how authoritarian regimes work. When everyone in government serves at the pleasure of the leader and can be removed for political disloyalty, You don't have a government of laws. You have a government of men, where everything depends on the personal whims and political calculations of whoever happens to hold power at any given moment. This is what Trump is trying to create. This is what he's asking the courts to allow. This is what's at stake in these legal battles that might seem technical or abstract, but are actually about the most fundamental questions of how American government operates and whether we still have any meaningful constraints on executive power. Understanding this context is absolutely essential to understanding why the current situation is so dangerous. We're not just talking about one firing or one lawsuit or one controversial decision. We're talking about a systematic attempt to dismantle the legal and institutional framework that has constrained presidential power and protected democratic governance for generations. We're talking about Trump trying to fundamentally transform the American system of government in ways that would concentrate unprecedented authority in his hands and eliminate the checks and balances that the founders considered essential to preventing tyranny. That's not hyperbole. That's not partisan exaggeration. That's an accurate description of what Trump is explicitly asking for in his legal filings and what his administration is systematically working to achieve through personnel decisions, court cases, and challenges to long-standing precedents and norms. And if he succeeds, if the courts allow it, if Congress doesn't push back, if voters don't hold him accountable, then American democracy, as we've known it for more than 2 centuries, will have been fundamentally altered. The system of separated powers and checks and balances will have given way to something much more like an elected dictatorship, where the president has essentially unlimited authority within the executive branch, and the only real constraint is the ballot box once every 4 years. That's the context. That's what's really at stake. That's why every one of these individual stories matters so much. They're not isolated incidents. They're pieces of a larger project to remake American government in ways that eliminate accountability and concentrate power in Trump's hands. Okay, let's break down what all of this actually means, because the implications are genuinely staggering when you start thinking through the various ways this affects different institutions, different groups of people, different aspects of American life, and the basic functioning of democratic government. First, let's talk about the immediate institutional implications. When you fire career officials for political reasons, when you purge experienced professionals who've devoted their careers to public service, when you install loyalists who care more about pleasing the president than doing their jobs competently, you do enormous damage to institutional capacity and effectiveness. These agencies exist for a reason. They protect consumers from dangerous products. They keep our food and water safe. They regulate financial markets to prevent another 2008-style crash. They enforce civil rights laws. They protect national security. They do thousands of things that Americans depend on, even if they don't think about it every day. When you gut these agencies of expertise and experience, when you create an environment where people are afraid to exercise professional judgment, when you prioritize political loyalty over competence, you make government worse at doing the things it needs to do. You increase the risk of preventable disasters. You reduce the government's ability to respond to crises. You create opportunities for corruption and abuse. None of this is theoretical. We've seen it happen before in other countries. We know what happens when authoritarian leaders purge institutions and install loyalists. The results are always bad for ordinary people, even if the authoritarians themselves benefit politically. Second, there are massive legal and constitutional implications that will reverberate for decades, regardless of how individual cases are resolved. Every time Trump pushes the boundaries of presidential power, every time courts allow him to do something that previous presidents couldn't do, every time norms are shattered without meaningful consequences, it creates precedents that future presidents can exploit. The damage isn't limited to Trump's term in office. It's permanent damage to the constitutional structure that's supposed to constrain all presidents, regardless of party. If Trump establishes that presidents can fire independent agency heads at will, every future president will have that power. If Trump establishes that presidents can use congressional investigations to attack and intimidate their critics, every future president will do the same. If Trump establishes that presidents are effectively immune from accountability for abuses of power, every future president will feel emboldened to push even further. The degradation of democratic norms and constitutional constraints is cumulative. Each precedent makes the next abuse easier. Each norm that's shattered makes it harder to maintain other norms. And here's the thing that should terrify everyone, regardless of their partisan affiliation. These expanded presidential powers don't disappear when your preferred party loses control of the White House. If Trump can do these things, so can the next Democratic president. If the presidency becomes an office with essentially unlimited authority to purge personnel, weaponize investigations, and operate without meaningful oversight, then that power will be used by whoever wins elections, and it will be used in ways that someone doesn't like. Authoritarianism is unstable. Once you break the constraints that prevent presidents from abusing power, you create a system where every election becomes an existential battle and every transfer of power becomes an opportunity for wholesale revenge. That's not sustainable. That's not a functional system of government. That's a recipe for eventual breakdown, whether through internal conflict or through the gradual loss of democratic character as authoritarianism becomes normalized. Third, let's talk about the political implications, because this is all happening in a very specific political context that matters enormously for how it plays out. Trump's approval rating is currently sitting at about 36%, which is historically low and suggests that most Americans are uncomfortable with what he's doing. The 2026 midterms are less than 2 years away, and Democrats are highly motivated to take back control of Congress. Republicans who enable Trump's behavior are going to face tough questions from voters about whether they care more about party loyalty than about protecting democracy and the rule of law. Democrats are absolutely going to make Trump's abuses of power a central issue in the 2026 campaigns. They're going to run ads featuring people who were fired for political reasons. They're going to talk about Trump's attacks on the justice system and independent agencies. They're going to frame the election as a choice between democracy and authoritarianism. And this message will likely resonate with suburban voters, independents, and moderate Republicans who are turned off by Trump's behavior, even if they agree with some of his policies. If Democrats take back the House in 2026, which is entirely possible given Trump's approval numbers and the normal midterm backlash against the party in power, they'll immediately launch investigations into everything Trump has done. They might pursue impeachment again, though conviction in the Senate would still be Unlikely as long as Republicans control that chamber. They'll hold hearings exposing abuses. They'll subpoena documents and witnesses. They'll make Trump's life miserable for the last 2 years of his term. But even if Democrats win in 2026, the damage will already be done. Institutional expertise that's been purged can't be instantly restored. Norms that have been shattered can't be easily rebuilt. Precedents that have been established don't just disappear. Democratic victories in elections can slow or partially reverse authoritarian trends, but they can't undo all the damage on their own. Real institutional repair would take years of sustained effort and a genuine bipartisan commitment to democratic governance, which seems unlikely given current levels of polarization. Fourth, there are enormous national security implications that aren't getting nearly enough attention in mainstream coverage. When you fire experienced intelligence officials, counterintelligence agents, and national security professionals because they're not sufficiently loyal to Trump, you make America less safe. Period. These are people with decades of expertise, with knowledge of ongoing operations, with relationships with sources and foreign partners, with understanding of complex threats from hostile foreign powers. When they're gone, that expertise is gone. Their replacements might be loyal to Trump, but they're not going to have the same level of knowledge or experience or professional networks. Operations will be disrupted. Sources will be compromised. Foreign intelligence services will notice when American agencies are in chaos and will exploit the opportunity. Russia, China, Iran, and other adversaries are watching all of this and adjusting their strategies accordingly. This isn't speculation. Intelligence professionals who are still in place are reportedly terrified about what's happening. Morale in agencies like the FBI and CIA is at historic lows. People are afraid to share information or make decisions because they don't know if they'll be the next target. Some of the most talented people are leaving for private sector jobs because they can't do their work effectively in this environment. Recruitment is becoming harder because who wants to join an agency that's being gutted for political reasons? The damage to America's intelligence and law enforcement capabilities will take years to repair, if it can be fully repaired at all. Foreign adversaries are getting bolder because they see American institutions in disarray. Allies are losing confidence in America's ability to keep secrets and maintain institutional continuity. The long-term national security costs of Trump's purges will be enormous, even if they're hard to quantify in the immediate moment. Fifth, let's talk about what this means for ordinary Americans in their daily lives, because these institutional battles might seem abstract or distant, but they have very concrete effects on real people. When environmental agencies are purged and regulations aren't enforced, more people get sick from pollution. When financial regulators are replaced with industry cronies, consumers get ripped off, and financial instability increases. When workplace safety enforcement becomes lax, more workers get injured or killed on the job. When consumer protection is gutted, dangerous products stay on the market longer. Government regulations exist because we learned, usually through painful experience, that markets don't automatically protect public health and safety. We regulate food safety because people used to die from contaminated food. We regulate drugs because pharmaceutical companies used to sell dangerous products without adequate testing. We regulate workplace safety because employers used to treat workers as disposable. We regulate financial markets because Unregulated finance repeatedly causes economic crises that destroy people's savings and livelihoods. When you politicize these regulatory agencies, when you staff them with people who care more about political loyalty than about doing their jobs, when you create an environment where career officials are afraid to enforce the law, real people suffer real harm. The harm might not be immediately visible. It might take months or years for contaminated products to cause enough harm that people notice. But the harm is real, and it's a direct consequence of prioritizing political loyalty over competence and expertise. Sixth, we need to talk about the precedent this sets for future presidents and future administrations, because that's ultimately what's most important here. If Trump successfully establishes that presidents can purge personnel for political reasons, that they can weaponize congressional investigations against critics, that they can operate without meaningful oversight or accountability, then every future president will do the same things. The next Democratic president will face enormous pressure from their base to purge Trump, loyalists, and install Democratic partisans. The president after that will do the same to them. You end up in a death spiral where government becomes completely subordinated to partisan politics, and every administration spends its first year destroying what the previous administration built. That's not a functional system. That's not a stable system. That's not a system that can effectively govern a country of 330 million people with complex modern challenges like climate change, technological disruption, global competition, and emerging security threats. It's a system that's eating itself alive, consuming its own institutional capacity in pursuit of short-term political advantages. And here's the thing. Once you go down that path, it's very hard to reverse course. Once the norms are broken, once the precedents are established, once the institutional damage is done, you can't just snap your fingers and restore everything to how it was. It would take years of careful, sustained, bipartisan effort to rebuild what's being destroyed right now. And given current levels of polarization and tribal loyalty, that kind of constructive, bipartisan cooperation seems almost impossible to imagine. So, what we're watching is not just a crisis for this particular moment. We're watching the potential unraveling of American democracy as we've known it, the transformation of our system from one based on laws and institutions and checks and balances into one based on personal loyalty and partisan warfare and the unchecked power of whoever manages to win elections. That transformation might be gradual. It might take years to fully play out, but every step in that direction makes it harder to reverse course and easier to continue sliding toward full authoritarianism. This is absolutely a five-alarm fire for American democracy. This is an emergency. This is a moment when everyone who cares about the future of this country needs to pay attention, needs to understand what's happening, needs to demand accountability from elected officials, and needs to vote in every election like the future of democracy depends on it, because it genuinely does. So here's the bottom line, and this is really important for everyone to understand clearly. What we're witnessing right now is nothing less than a full-scale assault on the foundations of American democratic governance. Trump is systematically dismantling the checks and balances that have protected this country for more than 2 centuries. Trump is eliminating anyone who stands in his way or who demonstrates insufficient personal loyalty. Trump is concentrating unprecedented power in the hands of the presidency. Trump is establishing precedents that will make it easier for future presidents to abuse power. And Trump is doing all of this with the active cooperation of congressional Republicans and at least the tacit approval of a conservative Supreme Court majority. This is not normal political competition. This is not typical partisan warfare. This is not just another news cycle in Washington. This is a deliberate, systematic project to fundamentally transform the structure of American government, to eliminate the institutional independence and legal constraints that have prevented presidents from becoming dictators, and to create a system where the president can essentially do whatever he wants without meaningful accountability. The scale and ambition of what Trump is attempting should be absolutely terrifying to anyone who cares about democracy and the rule of law, regardless of their partisan affiliation or policy preferences. Because once these constraints are removed, once the precedents are established that presidents can operate without oversight, once it becomes normal for presidents to purge critics and install loyalists and weaponize government power against their enemies, there's no going back. The damage is permanent. The transformation is irreversible without massive political effort that seems almost impossible given current circumstances, and we need to be clear-eyed about where this leads. History shows us what happens when democratic institutions are systematically dismantled and power is concentrated in the hands of a single leader who tolerates no dissent or accountability. It doesn't end well. It never ends well. Authoritarian systems are inherently unstable and corrupt, and eventually they either collapse into chaos or they calcify into permanent oppression. That's not the kind of country anyone should want to live in, regardless of whether they like Trump's policies or appreciate his political style. The immediate questions we face are both legal and political. Legally, will courts push back against Trump's most extreme power grabs, or will they continue to expand presidential authority and weaken constitutional constraints? Will judges appointed to uphold the rule of law actually do so when it matters most, or will they defer to executive power and allow Trump to proceed with his authoritarian project? We'll get some answers in the coming months as various cases work their way through the system, but the early signs are not encouraging given how the Supreme Court has ruled in recent cases involving presidential power and immunity. Politically, will voters hold Trump and his enablers accountable in the 2026 midterms? Will Americans who care about democracy turn out in massive numbers to support candidates who will actually provide some check on executive overreach? Will Democrats be able to effectively message around protecting democratic institutions, or will they get distracted by internal squabbles and policy debates while the fundamental structure of government is being dismantled? Will enough Republicans find the courage to break with Trump and put constitutional principles ahead of partisan loyalty? Or will they continue to enable everything he does out of fear of being primaried? These are the questions that will determine whether American democracy survives this moment or whether we continue sliding toward full authoritarianism. And make no mistake, the stakes could not possibly be higher. This is not about which party controls Congress or whether certain policies are implemented. This is about whether we maintain a system of government that includes meaningful checks on presidential power, protections for institutional independence, and respect for the rule of law, or whether we transform into something much darker and more dangerous. The historical question the one that future generations will ask, is whether this was the moment when American democracy began its terminal decline, or whether it was a temporary crisis that was ultimately overcome through the resilience of institutions and the vigilance of citizens. That question hasn't been answered yet. The outcome is not predetermined. But the direction we're heading right now should alarm everyone, and it should motivate everyone who cares about democracy to pay attention, to speak out, to demand accountability, and to vote in every election as if the future of the country depends on it. Because it genuinely does depend on it. The decisions being made right now, the precedents being established right now, the norms being shattered right now, the institutions being gutted right now, all of that will shape what kind of country we have for decades to come. All of that will determine whether we preserve American democracy for future generations, or whether we're the generation that allowed it to slip away through complacency, tribalism, and failure to recognize the danger until it was too late. This story is far from over. Watch how these court cases develop. Pay attention to what's happening inside federal agencies. Monitor Trump's approval ratings and whether they affect Republican behavior. Keep your eyes on the 2026 midterms and whether voters actually hold people accountable for enabling authoritarianism. Follow the investigations and lawsuits and congressional hearings that will continue to expose what's happening. This is the story of our time. This is the defining political battle of this era. This is the struggle that will determine what kind of country we leave to the next generation. And every single person has a role to play in how it turns out, whether through voting, through activism, through supporting independent journalism, through speaking out when they see abuses of power, or simply through refusing to normalize behavior that should never be considered normal in a democratic society. The fight to protect American democracy is happening right now in real time, and the outcome is not guaranteed. But if enough people recognize the danger, if enough people demand accountability, if enough people refuse to accept authoritarianism as the new normal, then maybe, just maybe, we can still preserve what the founders built and what generations of Americans have fought to protect. This is wild. This is absolutely wild. And it's only going to get more intense, more consequential, and more defining in the weeks and months ahead. Stay informed, stay engaged, stay vigilant, because democracy dies in darkness, and the only way to prevent that is to keep shining a light on what's happening and refusing to look away, no matter how uncomfortable or disturbing the truth might be. The future of American democracy is being determined right now, and whether future generations look back on this moment with gratitude for those who stood up and fought back, or with sadness for those who allowed it all to slip away, depends on what we do in this moment. So let's make sure we're on the right side of history. Let's make sure we did everything we could to protect democracy when it mattered most, because this moment matters more than almost anything else. And we don't get a second chance to get this right.